In this video about FusionReactor, I want to demonstrate one of the most important features of FusionReactor, which often some folks never ever notice. People tend to know about the graphical interface, maybe using the metrics, web metrics. That's a very common page to watch what's going on with regard to requests, with regard to queries, memory and CPU. Great page. But when things go wrong, maybe you're not on the computer to see it, or sometimes you might find you can't even get to FusionReactor or the ColdFusion or Rilo or Tomcat or whatever Java server you might be using. You might not be able to look at it to see what's going on. So while the interface is great, has a lot of wonderful things, it's very important to set up FusionReactor crash protection, alerting, especially alerting. So that's this feature down here called protection. Now, the protection has two things, and you want to choose settings. This restrictions is a feature we could talk about another time, but settings is the more important thing. And for instance, you might tell it to watch for when a certain number of requests are running. Okay, so I've got mine set up to tell me if ever 20 requests are running for 20 seconds. We'll talk about that more in a moment. Now I also want to point out that I'm looking at FusionReactor 5.2.5, your version. Things maybe look just a little bit different here on the FusionReactor About page, FusionReactor About page. I can see that mine is running 5.2.5. You can click this button to see if there's an update available for you. Anyway, so in the protection settings page, I would recommend most people set up at least this first alert, which is tell me if X requests are running for Y seconds. Now, how many that should be, it kind of depends. I mean, if I look at my server right now at Metrics Web Metrics on a quiet day, I don't have very much going on. There's virtually, no request activity. The request per second in dark green is very low. The number of requests running is very low. Now, let me go to a server that's got a little more activity. This is the demo.fusion-reactor site, demo.fusion-reactor.com. There you can see this light green. There's always at least one or more requests running, sometimes one, sometimes two. And there happens to be one that's always running, taking 60 seconds, then it finishes, then it starts up and takes 60 seconds, then it finishes. So there's always at least one or two running. Well, here's the thing. There's really no problem with one or two requests running taking a long time. Some people think, oh, that's got to be a bad problem. No, because if you look, again, I'm going to focus on ColdFusion for now, but the same concepts apply generally to other servers. If there's any limit at all in ColdFusion, it's under request tuning. There is a set of settings. If you're on ColdFusion Standard, you just have one. If you're on Enterprise or Developer or Trial, you have multiple values here. But you at least have this first one in ColdFusion, and whether it's 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, this stuff hasn't changed. This maximum number of simultaneous requests. So I could conceivably run 25 requests at once. Well, we're talking about, does this FusionReactor interface, this light green color, ever get more than a couple? And on my server at the moment, no. And on even this server that's the demo, there's never more than two. But if ever there were several or dozens, if your limit is 25, once you reach 25, no more requests could run. So it would be very helpful, even if you're not on this computer, looking at the monitor, if it happens in the middle of the day, while you're in a meeting, whatever, at overnight, you'd like to be notified if there are several requests running. And especially for a long time. Maybe there's one little spike of many requests, that's no big deal. But if there's many requests running, constantly running, the light green is running requests. If there's many running requests over a long period of time, that's worth being notified about. And that's what the protection settings request quantity protection is about. So I've said set it to tell me if 20 requests are running for 20 seconds. Now, I like to just have an email sent to me, but you could also queue requests. Now, ColdFusion and other Java servers might have their own queuing mechanism, so you may not need to additionally do queuing, but you could queue and email yourself. You could also reject requests. Now, that's a great feature. That's the protection element of this, both the queuing and the rejection. But frankly, I'm of the opinion that I just want to get the email, and I'll show you in another video what the email has, but it's very valuable. It'll tell you what requests are running, what IP addresses they came from, how long they've been running, what queries they've been running, and even down to the line of code, what they're actually doing at the moment that the alert fired. So that's really valuable. I love the alert. Now, that's this kind of alert. There's also a runtime protection alert. That is, tell me if any request takes more than Y seconds. I could say 20 seconds. Now, this sounds compelling. Maybe you might even want to say 200, whatever you think. But let me just say, again, one request running for a long time doesn't necessarily hurt anything. I mean, this request right here, this server which has this running request, if we watch the web request count, it's very high, 34,074,823, but as it refreshes, it's going up by about 15 requests every 5 seconds. So it's getting plenty of activity even though there's one long running request. So I'm not a big fan of being notified about one slow request, but if you want to, you can do that. So that's here, request runtime protection. You put a number in, tell it whether you want to notify or try to abort it, and it might be able to abort it, it may not, so that's a subject for another discussion. But again, I'm more a fan of get the alert. We can talk another time about what this means, but generally want to leave that set. Then finally, there's also memory protection. Now by default it's turned off, so this says never set memory protection, but again, this is new looking interface in 5.2.5. If you're on an older one, you put in a number which represents the amount of free memory below which an alert would be fired. Well, now it's in 5.2.5, it's a little bit different, and it's the amount of used memory above which an alert will be fired. Okay, so somebody might be inclined to think, yeah, I'd like to be told if, or do something if ColdFusion or Rilo or Lucy or Tomcat or JBoss or whatever you're running, if their heap is more than 75%. So I picked 76. Okay, that's what this alert is about. And you could also say, and if it's that high for a minimum of this amount of time. And you could do something like send yourself an email. But I'll argue that often Java application servers will run for longer than will have high memory and won't have a problem. And again, it's just like, just because the request is running long, that's not necessarily a problem. And just because memory is high, that's not necessarily a problem. But anyway, you can set up such an alert, and you can send yourself an email. You can also trigger, in some of the later releases of FusionReactor, you can trigger a garbage collection. And you can also tell it to set a minimum interval at which it'll do the garbage collection. And you can come and read more about this. I want to move on for the sake of time, but don't forget, you can always click on these buttons here, the I button, to be able to see more about these various features. I'm not going to save this setting. Again, I'm not a particular fan of getting a memory alert. To me, the canary in the coal mine is request quantity protection. Because if there are ever many requests running for many seconds, whatever the cause is, whether it's a memory problem, requests being slow, or something else, this will be the big deal if many requests start running. Now there may be other situations where you need more than this, but 90% of the time when I help people, if they would just set up this alert, that's all they really need. Now, having set up that alert, don't forget that you always need to save the settings, and then you want to come, if you want to get email, like I said I do, you have to come to email settings and tell it to enable it. Its default is disabled, so change it to enabled. There's also a feature that says how often will I get such emails. It defaults to a minute. I would argue leave it at that. If you've got a problem where there are many requests running for many seconds, you'd like to know if it's happening over and over again. So yes, it could mean you get a bunch of emails, but as long as that's happening, that's a problem. Now you can see why I'm not as big a fan of these other ones. If you get an alert every minute telling you there's one request taking a long time, you might start to ignore the alerts. That's not valuable. And if memory is high for an extended period of time and you're getting alerted every minute, that's not valuable. But if you get 20 requests running for 20 seconds, that would be something you'd want to know about every minute. So that's why this is the way I do it. You can also, and by default it does, track SQL statements in the notifications. And we'll look at the notifications another time. I want to try to keep this relatively short. But the SQL statement will show up in the alert. Really powerful, very valuable, and you can limit how long that is. And I really like this. You can have it track the user agent in the email notification. Now notice this warning. If you're on ColdFusion 8 or ColdFusion 9, you're warned to think twice about enabling that particular feature. I have done it on 9 and I didn't have a problem, but some people will want to heed that warning to not do it on ColdFusion 8 or 9, but certainly on 10 or 11 and other application servers, definitely enable that user agent. It's really valuable. Again, when we look at an alert email, you'll see why that's so valuable. And there's an option to control, to either show all threads. And again, I don't have time in this presentation to get into this, but I did a previous video on reading stack traces, and I'll show you in the video on looking at the alerts how we use those stack traces in the alert to understand things. Well, you can tell it to either show all threads currently in the JVM, only threads with open transactions, or no threads at all. Again, I prefer to generally get all threads because you never know what you might find when you look at them, but that's personal preference. Alright, so if we just do that, again, don't forget to save the settings. Then the last thing you need to do to get these emails, the last thing you need to do is go to FusionReactor Settings. FusionReactor in the top left corner, FusionReactor Settings. Now in there, when you first come to it, these are all empty. And you want to fill in what's the address from which an email will come, what's the address to which it will go. Now before I go any further, let me say a couple things. First of all, you notice I've said FusionReactor at. Some of you will go, well, I can't do that. My mail server won't let me do that. Well, maybe, but give it a try, because we're going to put the setting in and save it and test it. And if it works, that could be helpful to have the email come from an address. Some people even go further and say, I'll say FusionReactor dash machine name. So, or server name or instance name. So you could do whatever you want. In many servers, you'll be able to get away with it. But if you have to put in an address that's only valid, then put in a valid address. As far as the to address is concerned, remember, check these buttons out. You can put in multiple recipients separated by commas. So you could put comma on another address, comma on another address. All right. And then finally, you do need to configure what mail server you're going to use. Some of you will use a mail server off your server. Some will use a mail server that's on your server. If you're using Cold Fusion, I would recommend you just go look at your Cold Fusion administrator, go to the Mail tab, and see what the setting is in there, and do the same thing. So I've got my Cold Fusion server talking to a SMTP server that's on my machine, so I can say localhost. I don't need to use a username and password. You might have to, and there's reasons why that's not a bad idea. But anyway, and if you need to put in that username and password, you just repeat that here. And if you're using SSL or TLS, you can do that. If this is important to your mail server, this has to do with the canonical host name that'll be used to generate links and email messages. You can read about that, change it if you want to. It may not be important. But here's the very important point. Don't click send test email yet. Save your settings, then click test email. And when you do that, it'll pop open a box and it'll show whatever list you had in the to address list. You could remove a couple people from this while you're testing it just to make sure it's working. Then you click send email and you'll get a pop-up, and either it will be successful or it'll fail. And if it's successful, don't trust that alone. Go check your email, make sure you got it. And if you got it, then you can feel confident that your emails are set up. If it failed, here's the thing, if it failed, go to FusionReactor logs, and the first log that comes up is the reactor log, and you might find a discussion in this reactor log as to why it failed. You can also come up here and choose other logs, and you might look at the crash protection log and see if it had anything of interest related to setting up crash protection. And I don't believe any other one would be critical for solving a problem with that particular issue of the email not working. All right, so that's it. If you would do that, one other benefit of setting up that FusionReactor mail is as soon as you configure this, you'll also start getting a daily report. We'll talk about that another time, but you get a daily report telling you how the server is doing. That's worthy of another discussion, and in another talk we'll talk about looking at the alerts that come from this. But if you set this up, know that it's confirmed that it could send the email. Now you can sit back and wait for the next problem to arise and use those alerts to be able to understand the problems. And I know that can be frustrating when you've got a problem and you want to solve it, but the point is you've now set up something which will give you far more information, and we'll see in the next video what that information is, but you'll have far more information to really be able to solve the problem. And as you saw, I prefer to try to get that information and solve the problem as opposed to using features to try to kill requests or reject requests. That's an option. You can use it if you want, but I would really recommend you get the information, try to use it to fix the problem. Okay, and we'll talk about that in another video.